Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to set aside the headlines for a bit and turn our attention to one of the most persistent, challenging, and I think theologically rich corners of the biblical map. We're talking about the kingdom of Geshur.
Geshur. It's a name that for most people, even those who know their Bible pretty well, probably just gets skipped over.
Exactly. It feels like a footnote, you know. But what if we told you that this seemingly insignificant border kingdom actually holds a key to understanding one of the deepest vulnerabilities and also one of the greatest demonstrations of divine patience in the entire story of King David?
It absolutely sounds like a footnote, doesn't it? But you're right, it's anything but peripheral. When you look at the map, geographically, it's a small kingdom. It's located just east of the Sea of Galilee.
Okay.
So it's a literal meeting point of boundaries. It becomes this place of intense diplomacy, of really volatile marriages, and ultimately of those very consequential wars, both internal and external, that defined Israel's history during the monarchy.
So when we talk about Geshur being so central, what's the immediate theological implication? I mean, what's the one defining characteristic that puts this seemingly minor kingdom on the map for the long term?
The profound significance, I think, lies in the simple fact that Geshur remained. That's the key. The Israelites, back in the time of Joshua, they were commanded to drive out the inhabitants of the land they inherited.
Right, the conquest.
Exactly. But Geshur was one of those tasks they left unfinished. Joshua 13.13 is, well, it's brutally honest about it. It points out that Geshur and its neighbor Makkah, they maintained their place right inside Israel's intended borders.
So this act of partial obedience, or maybe we should call it a failure to complete the task,
I think that's fair.
that sets the stage for everything that follows. Every alliance, every conflict, every compromise.
That's it. And yet, and this is the incredible part, through all of that human failure, God moved his covenant purposes forward completely unflinchingly.
That immediately connects human failure to divine sovereignty. And that tension, God working through our incompleteness, that's a powerful theme. But let's connect this for the listener. Why should we, thousands of years later, really pause and examine this one little border kingdom? What's the ultimate payoff for understanding Geshur?
Well, the connection is direct, it's personal, and for the most central figure of Israel's kingdom story, King David, it's devastatingly profound.
Okay.
Geshur is linked directly to David through his wife Magacah. She was the daughter of Talmai, who was the king of Geshur, and this means that Absalom,
The son whose rebellion nearly tore the kingdom apart.
the very one, the son who nearly destroyed David's kingship and absolutely broke his heart. Absalom was literally a grandson of the Geshurite royal house. 2 Samuel 3.3 confirms it. So this seemingly distant border kingdom didn't just test Israel geopolitically. It tested the stability of David's family and the integrity of the covenant promise at its deepest, most intimate level.
Wow. So the initial failure to drive out the Geshurites back in Joshua's time, it creates this vulnerability. It's like a hairline fracture in the foundation that centuries later just explodes into a dynasty-threatening crisis right in the heart of the Davidic line.
It's a perfect way to put it.
That gives those opening verses in the book of Joshua so much more weight than we typically give them.
It absolutely does. It transforms the entire story of Geshur from, a piece of dusty history into a powerful illustration of long-term cause and consequence. The persistence of the Geshurites is, on one hand, a silent indictment of Israel's partial obedience, but on the other hand, it ultimately becomes the very stage for demonstrating God's sovereign preservation of the promised dynasty.
Okay, let's unpack all of this. Our goal today is to take a really deep dive into the rich analysis that's provided in the essay we're studying. We want to understand the historical background of Geshur. We want to trace its place in the tumultuous biblical narrative, synthesize the profound theological significance, and then finally we want to look for the practical and spiritual application for our own lives.
Right. We're looking to see how Geshur illuminates the unflinching nature of the Davidic covenant, even when it's right in the middle of human compromise and all this political complexity.
Exactly. So let's start with that historical and cultural background. Where exactly are we on the map?
Let's start with the map, yeah. And the physical world where Geshur existed. Biblical geography places Geshur firmly in the northern Transjordan region. So when you visualize this area, you're looking east of the Sea of Galilee.
Okay, so up in the Golan Heights area, modern day.
That's the region, yes. It's a territory of rugged approaches that climb up toward the formidable peaks of Mount Hermon and into the plateau of Bashan. Joshua 13, verses 11 and 12, confirms this northern eastern placement right within the territory that was meant for the half-tribe of Manasseh.
That sounds like a tough place to live.
Mm.
It's not, the fertile plain of the Jezreel Valley. What is that kind of location, nestled high up against mountain approaches? What does that imply about Geshur's political identity?
It implies strength and necessity. The essay describes Geshur brilliantly as a watcher of roads.
A watcher of roads. I like that.
And its strategic importance is just, well, it's hard to overstate. This region was the ancient Near East's nervous system. I mean, think about the critical arterial routes that crisscrossed here. First, you had the major north-south trade and military line, the King's Highway, or routes that were parallel to it, running from major centers like Damascus in the north, right past the Sea of Galilee, and down toward the Jezreel Valley.
So the route of empires and armies, the main highway.
Precisely. And then second, you had the east-west arcs. These were the routes connecting the Mediterranean coast with the deserts to the east, specifically routes that had to cross the Jordan River at its northern crucial fords. Geshur sat right on the ridges that overlooked all of this constant traffic.
So they saw everything.
Everything. Caravans carrying goods, envoys carrying treaties, and raiding columns moving with seasonal purpose. To live there was to live at a geopolitical seam.
A kingdom that sits on those kinds of seams, always watching the empires move by, they can't afford to be militarily weak or diplomatically clumsy.
No way! They absolutely had to be masters of survival and resilience. Their strategy had to be multifaceted. First, they needed robust, fortified towns for defense places that could withstand a siege.
Okay.
Second, they had to cultivate strong kinship ties and diplomatic relations with powerful neighbors, especially the rising Aramean powers to the north. And third, they needed to master the hire of diplomacy. I mean, knowing exactly when to ally themselves, when to pay tribute, and when to just maintain a strategic neutrality as the fortunes of larger powers like Egypt or Assyria or even early Israel rose and fell all around them.
The source material we're looking at also anchors Geshur's cultural identity by pairing it directly with Aram. What does that pairing tell us?
It gives us the precise flavor of this borderland culture. 1 Chronicles 2.23, it notes that Geshur and Aram took the towns of Jair. This pairing confirms its identity not just as some generic tribal territory, but as a Canaanite-Aramean kingdom.
So a mix.
A mix, yes. They were the product of the older Canaanite stock that resisted Israel's conquest, now deeply intertwined with the increasingly formidable Aramean powers that were centered in places like Damascus and Zobah to the north. This cultural blend, it really explains their tenacity, their strategic flexibility, and why they were so successful in maintaining their own identity right on the northern rim of Israel's inherited land.
Which brings us right back to that moment of partial obedience that really seals Geshur's long-term future in the biblical story. You call it the persistence of the borderlands.
This is the critical foundational detail. Joshua 13.13 contains that confession of failure. Nevertheless, the people of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites or the Maccathites. And then comes the vital phrase that turns this into an ongoing reality for the nation. But Geshur and Makkah live in the midst of Israel to this day.
And that phrase, to this day, that carries immense weight in the historical books, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It emphasizes that this wasn't just ancient history for them. It was an active, ongoing reality for the generations who were writing the biblical account.
It does.
So why is that detail, the detail about their persistence, why is it so essential for the overall biblical story and for the eventual Davidic crisis?
It's essential because it fundamentally changes the nature of Israel's mission. Their persistence underscores the reality of Israel's partial obedience and their failure to fully trust God to complete the task of conquest. Theologically, however, it sets the stage for God's providential patience. God works not exclusively through perfect, sweeping obedience, but often in the patient, ongoing process of keeping his people right in the presence of the testing and the partial obedience.
So their failure to conquer actually created a testing ground. It guaranteed that Israel's life would unfold with these persistent, culturally distinct, militarily savvy neighbors right next door. It forced a constant choice between trust and compromise.
Precisely. Their existence ensured that alliances and conflicts were inevitable, and that complicated the life of the nascent monarchy, and, most painfully, the life of David's own family. Geshur's continued presence is a testament both to human shortcoming and to God's absolute willingness to operate within that shortcoming to advance his deeper purposes.
Okay, before we jump into the narrative part of this, the essay we're working from stresses a really crucial distinction. It notes that there appear to be two biblical streams referencing Geshurites, one in the north, one in the south. Now, that distinction feels at first glance like it could be academic hair splitting. Does that one geographical detail really carry the weight of the entire Absalom story?
Oh, it absolutely carries the weight of the narrative coherence. We have to guard against confusing the two. The text actually presents two entirely distinct geographical groups using that name, Geshur.
Okay, so break it down for us.
First, we have the northern Geshur, the kingdom we're focused on today. This is the one tied to Aram, located in the Transjordan near the Golan Heights, the one in Joshua 13:13. This is the royal court. Second, we have the southern Geshurites. We find these mentioned in 1 Samuel 27:8. This is when David, while he's feigning loyalty to the Philistine king of Cush, goes on raids. These Geshurites are grouped with the Girzites and the Amalekites, and they're operating way down in the Negev region, extending toward Shur and Egypt.
That distance is enormous. I mean, we're talking about the deep north near Syria versus the deep south near the Sinai.
Yes. The geographical language in 1 Samuel 27:8, extending to Shur and Egypt, it's definitive. It points toward the southern desert, far, far away from Talmai's northern kingdom. So the simple textual conclusion is that this is a separate group. They likely retain the name from older Canaanite settlement patterns, or perhaps they were a splinter group.
Okay, so why is making that distinction so essential for David's story? What falls apart if we mix them up?
Well, it serves two critical functions. First, it guards against a kind of narrative absurdity. If we confuse the two, David would be seen raiding and slaughtering his future in-laws while he's under Philistine protection. That would make his later strategic marriage to Maacah, the Geshurite princess, diplomatically just impossible to rationalize.
That would certainly complicate the wedding plan.
Immensely. And second, and this is just as important, we avoid mislocating Absalom's flight. When Absalom murders Amnon, he flees north to Geshur to Talmai. That's in 10 Samuel 13. He does not flee to some random distant wilderness tribe in the Negev. So careful geographical reading is crucial. It keeps the political and the family narrative straight.
So geography is destiny in this case, and this leads us directly into the most dramatic part of this background.
Yeah.
The marriage as realpolitik. David solidifies the very border which Israel failed to conquer through a personal union.
Yeah, and this is where we see the human texture applied to the cold map. David's marriage to Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, is recorded in the 2 Samuel 3:3 as one of his early dynastic unions. We have to view this through the lens of ancient kingship. This was realpolitik. It was a policy of necessity securing volatile borders or maintaining peace through a diplomatic union rather than through military force.
And if Israel had completed the conquest way back when, this marriage wouldn't have been necessary at all. But because Geshur remained a sovereign power on his northern flank, David had to pursue diplomacy.
Exactly. It was a strategic decision to secure that volatile northern border, especially while he was busy consolidating power and dealing with the persistent threat of the Philistines and these nascent Aramean confederacies. Now, Scripture reports this practice, but it's important to remember that it doesn't endorse the wisdom or the motives behind every decision. It simply states the fact of the union.
So what was the trade-off here? David gained political stability, maybe, but at what cost to his covenant purity and ultimately to his own household?
Well, the trade-off was the introduction of foreign allegiance and divided loyalty right into the heart of the royal family. While the marriage provided a crucial channel for peace and potential trade with a persistent border state, the resulting complication of loyalties was immense. I mean, when you bring a foreign princess into the palace, her family retains expectations and potential claims. And this arrangement, years later, supplied the precise emotional and political backdrop necessary for Absalom's profound family grievance after the violation of his sister Tamar and his subsequent political ambition. The peace David secured on the border eventually led to utter chaos within his own palace walls.
So Geshur, the kingdom that Israel's earlier failure allowed to persist, it became inextricably linked to Israel's greatest king. The political compromise became a family tragedy.
That is the enduring, painful irony of the whole story. The border that was supposed to be secured by covenant obedience and conquest was instead secured by geopolitical calculation and marriage. And that compromise, while it seemed stabilizing in the short term, eventually resulted in profound internal distress that directly threatened the chosen covenantal kingship itself.
Okay, so let's move from the setting to the plot. Geshur is now deeply embedded in the life of Israel's king. First, let's revisit this idea of unfinished conquest and ongoing providence. We've established that Geshur's persistence was a failure, but how does the biblical narrative portray God's response to this?
The narrative is, it's clear and it's honest about the failure in Joshua 13. The land was allotted, but the task was incomplete. But the text doesn't suggest that God simply threw up his hands in frustration. It's stated without excuse, just acknowledging the reality of Israel's imperfect obedience. And this is where we see God's providence at its most patient.
How so? If the people failed, wouldn't the immediate consequence be judgment?
Often, yes, and there were consequences. But in this case, the nation's life unfolds with those unconquered neighbors nearby. Geshur's persistence actually serves to prove God's faithfulness, not only in the dramatic, sweeping victories of the conquest, but also in the long, patient keeping of his people, right in the presence of those who remained.
And we see that principle articulated later in the book of Judges, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Judges 2, verses 1 through 3, is explicit about this. God says, "He will not drive out the remaining nations, and they will become thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you." So Geshur's existence, therefore, becomes a sustained test of Israel's fidelity. It demanded constant dependence and a commitment to holiness amidst all these external pressures. Their proximity forced Israel to constantly navigate geopolitical and cultural ambiguity.
So it ensured that Israel could never become complacent. They always had to look outside themselves for security.
Exactly. It ensured the recurring lesson that the battle for their security, both physical and spiritual, was ultimately the Lord's. It wasn't the result of their own partial military success or their political maneuvering.
And this brings us to the moment where Geshur's persistence turns into the tragedy of David's house. The political background of the marriage suddenly becomes acutely, painfully personal.
The marriage to Maacah binds Geshur to David's inner court, and when the crisis of Amnon's murder happens, Geshur provides the natural and, frankly, the most secure refuge. When Absalom commits the murder, where does he go?
Right. He doesn't hide in Jerusalem or flee to the Philistines. He flees north to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, his maternal grandfather. That's 2 Samuel 13.37. And he remains there in exile for 3 years. And 3 years is a significant period. It's not a hasty escape. It's a sustained period of living under the protection of a foreign king, a king who's outside the bounds of the covenant.
It's a profound, agonizing delay of both justice and pardon. The essay we're drawing from wisely notes how the story turns on this ache of exile. Geshur becomes part of the physical and emotional texture of David's pain. I mean, can you imagine the communication or the lack of it between Jerusalem and the Geshurite court during that time? Absalom is safe, he's protected by royal family ties, but he's entirely cut off from the covenant center.
What do you think those 3 years in Geshur did to Absalom's spirit and his ambition?
Oh, I think it was catastrophic for his character. He was isolated from the community of faith, he was secure in a non-Israelite power structure, and he was able to just sit and nurse his grievance while being surrounded by foreign political ambition. And though Joab eventually engineers his return to Jerusalem, the true reconciliation with David, it lags for a long, long time.
Right, he can't even see the king's face for a while.
For 2 full years. And this whole period of delayed pardon and simmering unresolved tension, it allowed his bitterness to calcify into a full-blown political conspiracy.
So Geshur wasn't just a physical safe house for him, it was a psychological incubator for rebellion.
Precisely. His time there, secure under his mother's ancestral protection, it hardened his heart. Once he returns, the fuse is lit. He begins his campaign to steal the hearts of the people, and this culminates in a revolt that drives David from Jerusalem. The consequences of David's strategic marriage, which was facilitated by Israel's historical partial obedience, came home to roost, and it fractured the covenantal kingship from within.
Wow. Now, beyond the internal family drama, Geshur also fits within this broader context of Aramean conflicts. It helps define the limits of David's regional power. I think we need to spend some time on this because the essay really emphasizes the sheer scale of the Aramean threat.
We must. Geshur was situated right where David's kingdom collided with these powerful Aramean city-states. And the most formidable of these was Zobah, led by a king named Hadadezer. David's military campaigns weren't against small tribes, they were against a burgeoning regional power structure. 2 Samuel 8 records David's stunning victory over Hadadezer of Zobah. It was a massive victory. It secured David's control over vital trade routes, and it pushed his sphere of influence far to the north.
And the spoils of that campaign, they're often just glossed over, but the essay highlights their significance.
They are absolutely critical. David seized a tremendous amount of chariots, horsemen, gold, and especially bronze from the cities of Hadadezer. And the narrator inserts a very deliberate detail here. This wasn't just loot, this was sacred material. The gold and the vast quantity of bronze were later stored and then used to furnish the temple built by Solomon.
So that connects the messy, violent battlefield directly to the worship life of Israel.
It's a stunning theological statement. Victory was not credited to David's strategic genius or Israel's superior military resources. It was credited to the Lord who used the plunder of the Aramean world to beautify his own house. It confirms the belief that the Lord gives his king great victories, making the military campaigns acts of providence that resource the covenant community. It transforms geopolitical success into an act of worship.
So where does Geshur's neighbor, Makkah, specifically appear in this military context?
Makkah is explicitly involved during the severe Ammonite crisis, which is recorded in 2 Samuel 10. When the Ammonites secured massive foreign help against David, they hired Arameans from Beth Rehob and Zobah, the very same Aramean powers David had just fought, and they hired the king of Makkah with 1,000 men. So Makkah was clearly an active participant in the anti-Israel coalition.
And yet Geshur itself is not mentioned as mobilizing troops alongside Makkah against David. What should we read into Geshur's diplomatic silence during that war?
We can speculate. I mean, given that Talmai was David's father-in-law, Geshur likely maintained a very precarious neutrality. Or maybe their alliance with Israel was thin, but just strong enough to keep them out of the fighting, even if their closest neighbors were deeply involved. It just confirms that the region was a tinderbox, and Geshur, by necessity, remained in the complicated orbit of Aramean politics.
So the recurring lesson throughout all these conflicts, Absalom, Hadadezer, the Ammonites, it seems to be the same. David had to consistently seek the Lord.
That is the enduring wisdom derived from the constant turmoil. Israel learned, often painfully, that success required waiting for God's timing and help. David's wisdom wasn't in his military strength, but in his theological response. When he was facing the Philistines, he inquired of the Lord before battle. And later, when he was commanded to attack only after hearing the sound of marching in the balsam trees, he waited. He obeyed. This meant recognizing that the battle is the Lord's, a lesson constantly reinforced by the persistent threat of their neighbors, including Geshur and its allies.
So if we look at the entire arc of this narrative, Geshur really functions as a measure of God's faithfulness despite human inconsistency.
Exactly. The story is a consistent demonstration of God shepherding his absolute promise to David, the covenant promise of 2 Samuel 7, through a world that is defined by human errors, unfinished conquests, politically motivated marriages, devastating family failures, fitful reconciliations. Geshur marks the edge of David's kingdom, the rough horizon where the rock-solid faithfulness of God is made clearly visible against the backdrop of human compromise. The fact that the human pieces involved were often sharp and broken and ill-fitting only serves to highlight the unwavering reliability of the divine purpose.
Okay, so having navigated the history and the narrative plot, let's go deeper. We arrive now at the enduring meaning, the theological significance of Geshur's presence. And as you mentioned, everything in this discussion has to be framed by that absolute covenant frame established in 2 Samuel 7.
That's right. That passage is just monumental. It is God's unconditional pledge. He will secure David's house, he will raise up his offspring, and he will establish his throne forever.
And that's the immovable foundation.
It is. And the essential insight that Geshur offers is this. The divine promise holds firm while Geshur stands unconquered. While Makkah, the princess, complicates loyalties, while Makkah's countrymen march against Israel, and most painfully, while Absalom, Makkah's son, flees and rebels. Divine faithfulness simply does not rise and fall with the steadiness or the strategy or even the spiritual state of David or his descendants.
So the covenant secures the kingship entirely independent of the performance of the king.
It secures the office, yes. It secures the future trajectory that leads ultimately to the son of David. And this principle is what David acts out practically. When he waits for the sound in the balsam trees, that waiting is not a superstitious gesture, it's an act of covenant theology. It's demonstrating his belief that the ultimate power and victory belong to the Lord, regardless of how many chariots are arrayed against him. This faith is the constant counterpoint to the chaotic human drama that Geshur introduces.
So Geshur's persistence, then, it truly becomes a living parable for Israel. What precisely is the lesson this parable is teaching?
It's a parable about partial obedience and providential patience. The statement, the Israelites did not drive out the people of Geshur and Makkah, is a clear confession of an unfinished task. Yet, instead of immediate cataclysmic judgment, God orders Israel's history amidst these persistent, unconquered neighbors. This is God exercising profound patience, weaving his plan right through the fabric of their failure.
What was the intended purpose of allowing these neighbors to remain? Was it just a consequence, or is there more to it?
I think there was more. As the book of Judges warns, the neighbors became snares. There were constant temptations to idolatry and cultural compromise. But they were also tests. God's mercy preserved the people even when they failed and were delivered into the hands of their enemies. You see that all over Psalm 106. Geshur's survival is not seen as a fatal flaw in God's overarching plan, but as a necessary complexity. It was the complex field on which God trained his people to distrust their own military and political cleverness and to rely solely on him. The test forces dependence.
This raises that critical tension again. If God's covenant is unconditional and stands firm regardless of human failure, why should human strategy, like David's marriage to Maacah, matter at all?
And that is the essence of the responsibility that exists within the covenant. David's marriage to Maacah was a geopolitical strategy that completely exposed the limits of human calculation. He sought stability, but the union delivered instability and moral failure right into his own house. The tragedy of Tamar's violation and the subsequent fury of Absalom exposed the absolute necessity for personal and family righteousness.
So the covenant cannot be canceled, but the consequences of human sin are severe and immediate.
Precisely. Psalm 89 makes this distinction so clearly. God promises that he will not revoke the covenant, but he also clearly states that if David's sons forsake his law, he will punish their transgression with the rod. The Geshur episode illustrates that David's failures did not cancel the divine oath, but they carried profound, sometimes catastrophic, consequences for his family, his personal pain, and the peace of his immediate kingdom. We are fully responsible for the quality of our faithfulness, even as we trust in God's ultimate commitment. The most dangerous border, the Geshur incident teaches us, is the one between personal holiness and moral compromise.
It's moving that Geshur's story, which highlights so much internal division, also contributes to the wider theme in Scripture of the gathering of the nations. How does this small kingdom fit into that enormous vision of God's global plan?
Well, Geshur's existence within Israel's sphere of influence is an early, small-scale participation in this grand overarching theme. The Lord gathers the nations without erasing the distinct identity of Israel. The psalmist envisioned a future where all the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord.
Right, Psalm 86.
Exactly. And the prophets promised inclusion, too, noting that foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord and keep his covenant will be welcomed into his house. Isaiah 56 is clear on that.
And we find very tangible evidence of this inclusivity right in the midst of David's life, even among his most trusted fighters.
Yes, the inclusion is undeniable. You just have to look at the lists of David's mighty men, the core of his fighting force and his administration. The genealogies include men of Hittite descent, like Uriah, Ammonite, and notably men with Aramean connections. The inclusion of men from neighboring peoples, even those from the orbit of Geshur and Aram under the banner of the chosen king, provided a concrete historical preview of this wider mercy. David, for all his flaws, hosted and commanded men who were not native Israelites, and that foreshadows the comprehensive reach of God's eventual kingdom.
This brings us to the ultimate eschatological viewpoint. How do we read the preservation of the Davidic line through all of Geshur's complications in light of Christ's rule?
We read Geshur as part of the historical machinery God used to preserve the lineage. Geshur reminds us that even when the house was compromised, when a rebellious son fled to a pagan court, God's hand was actively keeping the promise alive. And we look forward to the ultimate fulfillment in the Son of David, Jesus Christ, who will finally sit on David's throne, establishing a kingdom that knows no end. Luke 1 is so powerful on that point.
So what does this Geshur story tell us about the current relationship between the church and Israel?
It underscores that God's plan is comprehensive. In Christ, the church is gathered from both Jew and Gentile into one new people, reconciled through the cross. We see that in Ephesians. Meanwhile, Scripture is also clear that the specific, distinct calling of national Israel remains intact in God's prophetic plan. Romans 11 makes that case. Geshur belongs to the earlier messy chapters of this grand story. Its name reminds us that, despite human errors, despite messy geopolitical lines, and despite divided loyalties, God writes straight lines through crooked terrain. His plan is resilient enough to handle all the human compromise involved.
Okay, this historical analysis gives us a tremendous framework, but now we have to turn this ancient map into modern application. The first spiritual lesson that comes out of this focuses on trusting sovereignty at the edges of our own lives.
The Geshurite map, the constant border pressure, the volatile neighbors, the ambiguity of alliances, it's profoundly relevant to the life of a contemporary believer. I mean, many of us live on borders of a different kind. cultural borders, vocational edges, relational fault lines where pressures converge, where clarity seems thin, and where competing loyalties demand our allegiance every single day.
We're constantly dealing with our own geshures, the parts of our lives where we haven't fully driven out compromise or where we've entered into questionable alliances out of what feels like strategic necessity.
Precisely. And the Gesher story encourages us profoundly that God's counsel stands firm across these seasons of intense pressure. His plan will not be foiled by the plans of the nations or by the chaos we feel at our personal borders. That's the promise of Psalm 33.
So what then is the practical call to action for us when we're facing our own pressures at the edge?
The call is identical to David's when he faced his enemies. Inquire of the Lord, wait for his specific signal, and confess with your daily choices that the battle, the result, and the long-term victory belong solely to him. We saw David's wisdom when he inquired before battle in 2 Samuel 5. The application for us is immediate. Before making a vocational alliance or a financial decision or a relational commitment, we must seek divine direction. We have to cling to the truth of 1 Samuel 17.47, that our success is not determined by our human resources or our cleverness, but by divine intervention. When you feel stretched thin on the edge, you have to cling even tighter to the sovereignty at the center.
The narrative also issued a stark warning of unfinished business, particularly regarding the need for holiness at the boundary lines.
Yes, that is the cost of partial obedience made tragically clear. Because Israel failed to drive out Geshur and Makaka, they remained. And that required Israel to exercise extraordinary wisdom and holiness to live faithfully near these competing loyalties. The survival of these groups meant Israel was constantly exposed to their cultural, their military, and their religious influence.
So how does that vulnerability translate to the modern church? What are our specific analogous pressures today?
We face analogous pressures where the world's liturgies, its established, pervasive patterns of worship run parallel to the church's worship. We're pressed to adopt the world's definitions of success, things like consumerism that defines our worth by what we acquire, or political polarization that demands absolute loyalty to a faction over Christ, or just the relentless pursuit of affirmation. The pressure is to compromise our core identity.
So it's not just a matter of external threats, it's the pressure to adopt the world's strategy for success.
Exactly. And the essay stresses that the answer is neither total withdrawal nor compromise with these idols. The answer is steady, consistent faithfulness, shaped profoundly by the Word and guarded by the Spirit. Romans 12 and Galatians 5 are so clear on this. The key takeaway from Geshur is profound. Holiness at the center of our lives, our private worship, our personal character is the only thing that keeps the external borders from becoming gateways for internal decay. If the center is compromised, the borders will inevitably fail, just as the rot began in David's own household and flowed out into his public life.
Speaking of David's household, let's explore that lesson of sanctifying strategy in the household. David's strategic marriage was, in one sense, a political success that resulted in a catastrophic family failure. What lessons should leaders and parents take from this today?
This is a tremendous warning to those in positions of influence. David's royal household decisions had massive national repercussions. The wound of Tamar and the fury of Absalom unfolded within a family that was supposed to embody God's covenant promises to the world, and it delivers a profound caution. No amount of successful political calculation or professional achievement or strategic alliance can possibly compensate for the absence of righteousness and spiritual integrity in the home.
If the king's house is unstable, the kingdom cannot be secure.
Precisely. Leaders, parents, church officers, we all need the wisdom that James 3.17 defines, wisdom that comes from above. It is pure, peace-loving, considerate, full of mercy, and sincere. David chose a strategic marriage for geopolitical gain. James urges us to choose wisdom for spiritual gain. The truth is, faithfulness in private is not a secondary requirement to public skill. It is the ultimate test. Proverbs 24 is so clear. By wisdom, a house is built. Through understanding, it is established. Geshur reminds us that private compromise inevitably metastasizes into public, painful crisis.
I find it moving that Geshur, the kingdom of David's in-laws that contributed so much pain and conflict, also ultimately invites a message of hope for outsiders and inclusion.
This is the essential mercy note that has to sound above the din of war and politics. Geshur's persistence alongside Israel and the historical reality of Aramean men serving among David's heroes, it signals that the Lord's mercy reaches beyond Israel's familiar traditional lines. David's house, flawed as it was inclusive enough to welcome these outsiders who bound themselves to his anointed leadership.
And the ultimate Christ application expands this inclusion to the ends of the earth.
Yes, in Christ, this vision is fully realized. Those who were once far away, both geographically and covenantally, are brought nearby his sacrificial blood, permanently tearing down the dividing wall of hostility. That's the heart of Ephesians 2. The goal of God's plan is a single new people, a multitude gathered from every nation, tribe, and tongue, worshiping one Lord. Revelation 7 gives us that picture. And this calls congregations today to actively embody that hope, welcoming repentant sinners of every background and teaching them to love the Son of David, confirming that the dividing wall is destroyed forever.
And finally, the story of Absalom's long stay in Geshur, those 3 years of delayed pardon, it teaches us a great deal about steadfast perseverance and waiting.
This is perhaps the most personal and pastoral application of the Geshur story. We noted that Absalom's exile lasted 3 long years. His subsequent return was complicated, and David's deep mourning over his son, it didn't just vanish overnight. The biblical record does not sugarcoat these long valleys of family pain, of delayed reconciliation, and of hard ambiguity.
And many believers today live in those same long valleys, waiting for healing, waiting for justice, waiting for a family member to return to the faith, or just waiting for a prayer to be answered.
And the Geshur story sustains us by demonstrating that the Lord remained absolutely faithful to his promise and to his covenant throughout those 3 years and beyond. The delay was real, the pain was intense, but God did not abandon his purpose. The scriptures teach us to persevere and to maintain hope in the face of what feels like a half answer. We are actively taught to pray, as the psalmist did. In the morning I lay my requests before you and wait expectantly. That's Psalm 5.3. We are to keep walking in obedience while we wait, confident in the faithfulness of the one who promised. God's purposes are neither hurried by our panic nor permanently hindered by our human limits. We can find rest in that divine patience.
So Geshur, the border kingdom, is indeed far more than a geographical footnote. It marks the rough edges of Israel's story, the place where neighbors remained, where marriages secured a fragile peace, where sons fled in rebellion, and where a great king was forced to learn again and again that his strength and his stability lay not in his strategy, but in the Lord who called him.
Through the whole saga, the covenant stands firm. God keeps his word to David even when David's own house wavers dramatically, and he keeps his people secure amid nations whose fortunes rise and fall only under his ultimate sovereign hand. Geshur is a profound historical reminder that God's faithfulness reaches even to the borders of our own unfinished business and our human inconsistency.
We'll end with a powerful encouragement from the Psalms, which perfectly encapsulates the confidence we gain from understanding God's control over the nations, even the persistent border kingdoms like Geshur.
Psalm 33, verses 10 through 12, presents the final word of confidence. The Lord foils the plans of the nations, he thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance.
The encouragement is just so clear. While human plans, whether they're the strategic marriages of David, the murderous ambitions of Absalom, or the tactical maneuverings of King Talmai, they rise and they fall and they often cause great pain, the Lord's counsel stands firm forever. We are called to live patiently, steady at the center of our faith, confident that the Lord will absolutely finish what he began, both through his church globally and in your life personally.
May you find deep and abiding rest today in the unwavering purposes of the Lord, our eternal inheritance.